Welcome to everyone. We're delighted to have you with us, to our viewers, and also our steadfast friends at Kendall on Hudson, Club at Briarcliff, and our new friends at Pace University in Pleasantville. Also joining me are our committee members, Tyler Beebe, Naomi Marrow, Peter Russell, and Don Shields. So this is our last program for the fall, and we are delighted to be talking about Italy. Italy is one of those places I think we all conjure romantically and feel as though we all have some touch with that country and feel very sort of involved with what's going on, the sites, and so on, that are really part of, in a way, Western civilization. So our whole outlook on the way that we see things also. What we may not know so much about is really how Italy views the rest of the world, and most particularly Russia, China, the United States. And so we will be talking about that with our speaker, Giovanna de Maio, shortly. So she will speak for 20 to 30 minutes, followed by questions, first from our group, then your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Our programs are being recorded and they can be accessed at the Chappaqua Library website. So before I turn to our host, Peter Russell, to introduce our speaker, I'd also like to ask Tyler if he would say a few words about our very special person to the Foreign Policy Discussion Group. Tyler.
Yes, well, good morning. And on behalf of the group's planning committee, I would like to salute Don Shields, a longtime member of the committee who has decided, much to our regret, to pursue other interests. Now, for the last 18 years, since 2005, Don has been instrumental in attracting informative, engaging speakers to our programs and has hosted their presentations and the Q&A sessions that have followed. His contributions, along with those of Mal Nietzsche, who you recall passed away earlier this year, and others, especially John Cerise, has helped to make the Foreign Policy Group the success it is today. So we will all miss Don's observations and inputs, along with his grace and humor, and hope he will continue to offer his perspectives from the sidelines going forward. So Don, a toast to you and your devotion to the Foreign Policy Group, and good luck in the future.
Here's to me with my coffee.
Here's to you, exactly.
Thank you, Tyler. Your words are comforting by this time of my life. And I have so much faith in June and Peter and Naomi and you and Joan to keep this show on the road well into the future. So I retire quite happily, thank you very much. And I look forward to observing how well you're going to be doing in the future. Thank you very much for having me here today.
Don't forget the Q&A. You still have a voice, you know.
That's right.
So anyway, shall we now turn to our program? So Peter, if you would start us off.
Yes, good morning, everyone. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Giovanna de Maio, non-resident fellow at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and adjunct professor at the Paris School of International Affairs. Her research focuses on transatlantic relations in the context of great power competition. Prior to joining George Washington, she was visiting fellow at the Center for the United States and Europe at Brookings Institution in Washington. For 2 years, Dr. de Maio worked as a postdoctoral fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States and at the Paris Institute of International Affairs, where she focused on Russia's influence in Europe. She holds a PhD from the University of Naples, L'Orientale. Dr. de Maio was asked if she would kind of walk us through the domestic policy groundings of Italy's foreign policy. And just a word to say that Italy is famously complex. It is a country that's one of the major members of the European Union. It plays a significant role there. Several of its leaders, Mario Draghi, Mario Monti, and the former leader of the foreign policy function at the EU, Federica Mogherini, have all been distinguished leaders on a European level. At the same time, domestic politics, influenced very much by populism, have taken Italy different ways from time to time. There's kind of an ongoing struggle there, if you will. And Dr. Di Maio has prepared remarks for us today, focused, it kind of brings all this together, focused on Italy's Russia policy. Giovanna, thank you for being with us. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, June. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And I'm feeling particularly lucky since it's also probably Don's last panel with this series. So I'm very happy that I also will have the privilege to discuss these issues with him. The reason why I wanted to on Italy's Russia foreign policy towards Russia is because there has been lots of changes in the world lately with the war in Ukraine, and I believe the policy towards Russia is something that was really affected, and is particularly interesting to see how Italy's posture has evolved over the history, and especially if we look at how the two countries were particularly connected culturally, economically, and how this has transformed over the years and to change drastically in the past couple of years. And to do that, I have prepared a very short presentation so you can follow me probably more easily. It's just a few pictures that can help us go through some of the key events that I'd like to discuss. Here is a quick table of content of what I'm going to discuss today. You have Italy's historical ties with Russia, how those evolved during the Soviet Union, how they developed over energy and more broadly trade. And then we'll see after the 2008 economic crisis and the rise of populism, Russia was able to extend its hand over Italian politics. And then obviously we will go through some recent elements from the Mario Draghi government to the latest one of Giorgia Meloni, that is, as some of you may know, a far-right leader that has been quite revolutionary in her new stances vis-a-vis the landmarks in Italian politics. So to start off, I just wanted to recall a couple of historical elements that can help us understand Italy's historical posture vis-a-vis Russia. Italy is a middle power in the center of the Mediterranean, so has always sought to create relations with outside powers that were stronger than Italy itself. At the same time, having this unique touch, unique sense of history and culture. As you can see, there is a picture on my left. Here is the Peterhof Palace in St. Petersburg, and on my right, I see the one of the Kremlin's tower. And those pictures reflect. I put them there to show that actually there were Italian architects that helped building one of the towers of the Kremlin back in the 1700s, and to restore one of St. Petersburg Palace, the Peterhof Palace, as well as many others in St. Petersburg that was the city that Peter the Great created, modeling actually European cities. And it was actually in Venice that there was the first consulate of the Russian Empire in Europe. The situation deteriorated, the relationship between those two countries deteriorated a little bit with the War of Crimea in the 1850s. But then during World War II, the two countries kind of merged and in their common interest against Austrian Empire after for its dominance in the Balkans. Indeed, these ties also developed during the Soviet times. You see my right, the person on my right is Maxim Gorky, Soviet leader, intellectual, actually communist intellectual that was that used to go to Capri in southern Italy to hold these retreats for communist intellectuals, and so did many others. And on my left, you see in the Cyrillic alphabet, it's written Togliatti, in Italian Togliatti. It's the name of the head of the Communist Party, whose name was Palmiro Togliatti. He was the secretary of the Italian Communist Party for a decade, and this is the name of the city that the Soviet leaders named after him when they created it for it to be an industrial town to produce the famous Ziguli car. So you can see that those ties were not just intellectual. The Communist Party in Italy was very, very strong, had a very strong leadership in its opposition to the Christian Democrats that were in power after World War II. And at the same time, these ties were very, very strong and were slowly but surely developed in the automotive mechanics, but also, and probably I would say first and foremost on energy. You see these two handshakes. The man with glasses is Giovanni Gronchi. He was the president of the Italian Republic in 1960s. He was the first Western leader to go to the Soviet Union in the 1960s to secure energy contract for Enrico Mattei in the other picture. The of the Italian ENI, a very the most important energy company in Italy, and they secured a deal for the supplies of oil, and then following to that gas from the Soviet Union to Italy. And these two economies developed in a very complementary way. Russia as a deliverer of raw materials and energy, and Italy producing more mechanics, more sophisticated pieces of industry and the automotive industry and design. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, Italy preserved this approach of communication, intellectual ties, dialogue with Moscow. And you can see that that was also facilitated by personal ties. As you may recall, Italian leader Silvio Berlusconi, who's been in Italian politics for over 20 years, he also played a major role in connecting Italy with Russia. And in particular, I call it the double track policy, because we know that Italy is one of the founding fathers of the EU, of the European Union. Italy is also a proud member of the NATO alliance. At the same time, while seeking and strengthening its Euro-Atlantic integration, Italy preserved this posture of dialogue and communication with Moscow. And how did it do that? First and foremost, Italy was very aware and pushed a lot for NATO and Russia to converge, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union. That, obviously, since NATO was born to counter the influence of the Soviet Union, that was also perceived negatively by Russia. So one of the concerns of Italy was that there was some sort of way for NATO and Russia to coexist. So Italy was between the supporters of the NATO-Russia Founding Act in but also in a summit in Rome, that Italy heavily diplomatically invested in the creation of the NATO-Russia Council in 2002, facilitated by Berlusconi himself, to improve relationship between these two these two entities, but also I would say a matter of caution in the European Union. Italy was very aware and careful with the so-called Eastern Partnership. I think many of you know that Eastern Partnership is the program that the European Union had to address countries in the former Soviet space, that then led in some cases to the enlargement to for countries that belonged to the former Soviet Union, like Poland or Czech Republic, for example. So Italy was very cautious about, like, once those countries went in, and the Eastern Partnership programs, especially vis-a-vis Georgia or Moldova or Ukraine for that matter, Italy was always aware, not wanting to step on Moscow's feet regarding this, knowing that these countries were particularly worried about Moscow. Knowing that Russia was going to perceive this Eastern Partnership as overstepping its own sphere of influence. So Italy continues on this track of, like, yes, I'm a proud member of the Euro-Atlantic integration, but also of connection and dialogue, seeking bridges, to build bridges with Russia. And in fact, as I was hinting on earlier, I'm very sorry for the multilingual graphs over here, but I sit in France and I'm Italian originally, and there is a bunch of those languages mixed up. You'll see on the right the European countries that are more dependent on Russian gas. And you see that Italy comes right after Germany for 46% of import of Russian gas. This data is referring to the pre-2022. And then on the right, you'll see the sectors that are in which Italy-Russia ties are particularly strong, like mechanics, fashion, chemistry, furniture, metals, electronics, and so on. So you see that this is these two economies were again complementary: raw materials on one side and more industrially labored products, the Italian perspective, and also from fashion and design. In this regard, since he passed this year, I wanted to put a picture of Silvio Berlusconi and showing how he also facilitated, this is related to what I was talking to you about earlier, facilitating ties between the United States and Russia, between NATO and Russia, but also developing a personal friendship with Vladimir Putin, and you see them in the other picture on vacation together, in probably one of Berlusconi's residences. So you see this connection that are built also on that. But then what happens in 2014? There is the Ukraine crisis, the invasion of Crimea, and you see that Italy does not oppose sanctions. Italy, just like any other European country, adopts sanctions, recognizes that the invasion and the annexation of Crimea was illegal, was not recognized in international law. And so you see that from, you know, the curves for both import and export are sharply decreasing after precisely between 2013 and 2014, and then keeping on going down because of by the effect of the sanction that actually have a very significant impact over the relationship, over the small and medium enterprises from Italy that were exporting to Russia. I see some comments already. Berlusconi and Putin, two strongman fascists. I have a lot to talk about. Yes, we'll discuss about it later. Definitely personalized politics. So in this regard, we see that indeed the impact of sanction is really crucial. for Italian economy. We can see that after some time, the enterprises on both hands found a way to go around the sanctions, but still the impact has been very strong. And this economic impact was also happening at the same time of the rise of strong anti-EU sentiment. Sorry, one second. This strong anti-EU sentiment in Italy was developed starting from the subprime crisis in 2008, but really in the years that followed, basically from grievances with the European Union. You also may remember the default of Greece and all the reforms that were needed to avoid actually this default of Greece itself. And so in Italy, we saw really the rise of two kinds of populism, one that was more left-wing and the other one more right-wing. The left-wing one was very socialist, strongly supporting, like going against the fiscal rules of the European Union. And the right-wing one was more nationalist. You see his name, the person with the T-shirt of Putin, his name is Matteo Salvini, photographed in Moscow, that was fascinated with Putin's strongman attitude, a very sovereigntist ideology, protecting the borders, interest of Russia at all costs. So Matteo Salvini, the leader of the league that you see here in the picture, he advocated for Italy to be strong, to be very much anti-immigration, and to push forward a policy that was conservative, the same way Russia was. And we can go back to this when we will go Q&A. But just so you know, these are the two branches of populism in Italy that kind of probably converge in anti-EU position, and obviously here anti-sanctions. Both of them were anti-sanction. And indeed, what happened in 2018, the election, they got a lot of momentum, and they ended up governing together for a year. In 2018, they formed the government. They had very strong differences because one is more right-wing and the other one is more left-wing, but they ended up working together. And we can definitely say that Russia also played a role in the way their campaign was held. In particular, we see that Italy was targeted by lots of disinformation campaign from Russia through the network that is called Russia Today, basically also retweeting lots of this, reposting lots of this party's electoral campaign ideas, but also in some ways providing alternative facts, fake news that would boost the arguments that those two parties were in a way promoting. And it's interesting because this is the same time when in the US there is the presidency of Donald Trump, and also the disinformation activity that Russia conducted in the US, this disinformation that Russia conducted in France, for example. And this really was a widespread network that Russia tried to work on. This was very profitable for Russia because both these parties were actually advocating not just for lifting sanctions, but also for the European Union and Italy to focus more on the southern neighborhood because they were concerned by immigration. So focusing more on the southern neighborhood rather than the eastern neighborhood like Ukraine and sanctions and so on. So very profitable partnership. And even we know that Salvini and his party went to Moscow and signed a memorandum of understanding with United Russia Party in Moscow. is the party, the leading party. And we know that on the left, we have Alessandro Di Battista from Five Star Movement, who once their party was in the parliament, actually they spoke, they held meetings against the dollarized world, or even at some point they had submitted a resolution basically wanting to rediscuss Italy's commitment to NATO every 2 years. This didn't pass, but still, that gives you the understanding of their stances. When though they went into power, they had less of that, because Italy is a different system than the US, is less centralized system, lots of coalition politics. So it was difficult for them to actually implement something different than they would have done, like interrupting sanctions and so on. So they didn't actively pursue that, but the posture of Italy in Europe was very much decredibilized, delegitimized because of their stances. Moving forward, what's also interesting to remember, to highlight, is that contrast between these two parties and what came afterwards, after the pandemic. That was mostly because of the leadership of Mario Draghi. Some of you may remember he was the governor of the European Central Bank, so he had a very well-known reputation. His leadership was particularly appreciated in Europe, especially during the 2008 economic crisis. He's famous for a sentence. He said, "We'll save the European Central Bank, will save the Europe, whatever it takes. He'll do whatever it takes to save the euro." So that actually reassured markets and helped the European Union navigating through the storm. Well, as soon as Mario Draghi comes to power, because of it's a complicated dynamic, but Italy sometimes has those technical governments that are not directly elected. When there is a government crisis, this is one of the outcomes that can happen, a technical government that can basically shepherd the last phases of the government. And Mario Draghi was in charge for like a year, and he had a completely different posture. He tried to, from the get-go, establish a very strong Italy's posture in the EU, in the European Union, and in NATO, and in the Atlantic zone, in Atlantic interest in area. And it's very, he was very clear about that, and he was very appreciated in the Western world because of this posture that in a way resolved former ambiguities that were resulting from the previous governments. And in fact, it's not a coincidence that during his leadership, Moscow actually multiplied the spies and the attacks and cyber attacks against Italy. So you could sense that they were fearing such a posture from the Draghi's government. At the same time, he, kind of like Macron in France, he tried to even make a trip to Moscow with Macron and German Chancellor Scholz to try to convince Vladimir Putin of, scaling down the tension at the time at the border with Ukraine. This was before the invasion. So this posture of dialogue kind of remained, but in more realistic terms, very centered and grounded in the transatlantic space. And you can see that even after the start of the war, there were concrete measures to decrease and detach Europe, but Italy in particular, from Russia. In fact, one of the actions that we can see that is more sharply visually comes to our eye is the decrease in imports of Russian gas. You can see that it went from 30%, 31% to 13.9%. And this is very important because, you know, as I was recalling earlier, Italy is very energy poor, doesn't have lots of natural resources, it's a small country, very densely populated with lots of energy needs, and was able to reassess, reroute its energy supplies from Algeria and Libya, for example. Very, very strong activism in the African countries, but in Saudi Arabia as well. So you can see that this was concretely taken. Sanctions were sharply and strongly applied, and you can see that this also particularly deteriorated relations with Russia. So I wanted just to stress on this point because it goes from a very strong, very interconnected, very complementary economies to a huge drop in one of the main drivers of this, and huge drop in also the ties between the two countries. And to show you how the war in Ukraine has really shaken like souls and minds in politics, obviously, in Europe. And then we get to our, and probably it's going to be between my last points that I'm going to make before Q&A. Then we get to Giorgia Meloni, got into power last year. And she, as you can see her in the picture with Steve Bannon, she's a far-right leader, very close to the American alt-right circles, very nationalist posture. She won the elections in a coalition, actually, with Berlusconi and with Salvini, the person I showed you in the T-shirt of Putin. So, and she was able to kind of establish herself as the leader of the far right. At the same time, she had to balance these two personalities that were very closely connected with Russia. At the beginning, there was a lot of uncertainty regarding Italy's posture. People thought that given the influence of Berlusconi and Salvini, this would have been a pro-Russia government. Giorgia Meloni is also close to Viktor Orban in Hungary, that is very close to Moscow. So that was the expectation, but instead she kind of went against that, and she firmly took over and continued the line inherited by Mario Draghi, trying to not to create any disruption in the transatlantic space, applying fully subscribing to sanctions and to Euro-Atlantic community posture against Russia, while also continuing the energy transition with more concrete plans for Italy's gas supplies. And this is a very interesting combination, because on the one hand you have Italy that does not want to be isolated in the G7 domain and sphere, wants to keep ties with the US. Giorgia Meloni was always closer to the American circle, very, very conservative circles compared to the Russian ones. It was more closer to the American ones. So she wants to keep strong ties with the United States. At the same time, domestically, she's very much behaving like a very strong nationalist leader, very far-right leader, very anti-immigration. And this is the worry that many analysts have, that, you know, on the one hand, the fact that she is behaving correctly on the foreign policy is kind of obscuring what she's doing on domestic side, in which she's producing a very ethno-nationalist discussion on the Italianness, Italian people, very, very cutting down on rights of immigrants, but also of same-sex couples, for example, adopting children from abroad and registering them as, you know, parents of both parents, and children of both parents, and as well as promoting an idea of Europe that is not the one that Draghi had in mind, a stronger, a more united, but instead promoting the idea of a more federalized, a more sovereign Europe that wants to be less involved in domestic affairs and leaving more and more space to the individual member states. So that is the direction towards which Europe is going to profound changes dictated by the war in Ukraine, but the directions that this can take are multiple. They can be a more the disunited Europe, but it can also be more federalized depending on the outcome of the many elections that we have this year. And I will stop here and I would look forward to Q&A. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Giovanna, very, very much for tying all those threads together and showing us the path that Italy is following at the moment. Let me start with one question. It ties in a little bit with Ukraine and the contest with Russia. And that is one of the areas that Europe has been trying to get its act together and act in greater unity is defense, having common procurement and integration of forces and industrial base to support defense. And I think I read just this week that the Italians had turned down a combination of a couple of companies in the sector, which is kind of a sign that they may not really want to support that as much as the challenge demands. Can you just comment on the defense aspect of Italy's role?
Thank you, Peter. Yes, defense has been one of the most important areas in which the European Union has tried to embrace collective actions. In particular, not just they were able to mobilitate the European Peace Facility to help Ukraine financially, but also doing joint procurement for ammunition and sent to Ukraine, but also helping the delivery of these weapon systems to Ukraine. The question that is ahead for the European Union now is how to make this effort sustainable in the future, knowing that in the United States what we're seeing is less and less public support, public appetite, Congress support for Ukraine, for sending weapons to Ukraine is decreasing. In the meantime, we also have a crisis in the Middle East. So all of this contributes to a sense of how are we going to be able to sustain this effort, knowing that Ukrainians are fighting also for the freedom of Europe and deterring Russian aggression. And one of the means, and you have several schools of thoughts on this, some countries in Europe are trying to increase connections with the United States, trying to buy weapon systems from the United States or South Korea or outside of Europe in general, with the idea if they're able to buy US weapon systems, then the US, even in case of a Trump presidency that may undermine NATO, they will still come and help because of this transactional ties coming from security. Some countries in Europe are making this calculation to increase interconnections with the United States, and therefore in the hope of somewhat buy their protection. Some other countries like France, where I sit, have been calling for more joint procurement, more joint actions in the European defense, but also on more budget and fiscal flexibility to allow member states to invest in their own defense. Think about this. When we do investment plans, we're not just investing for today, we're investing in something that is 10 years from now. So if we keep on buying ammunitions or weapon systems that are available on the counter, we are not investing in our own capacity for technology, research, development that can actually have also a return of investment in our communities. So France's idea, for example, is we obviously were scared of Trump too being potentially undermining transatlantic alliance. But at the same time, even if it's not the case, we need to be able to sustain the long-term effort, because this is going to be a very long-term war. And we need to be able to help Ukraine. But to help Ukraine tomorrow, we need to invest today. On Italy's perspective, probably the details of the deal were not particularly enticing for Italy, but there is definitely a question that some European countries, such as Italy, or even, I mean, the UK is no longer in the EU, but in the broader Europe, the UK is also very connected to the F-35 defense line and production line. Italy is very connected with the American one, and there is some competition between the European companies, because don't forget, we are different countries with different industries that may compete for the project. So the challenge for us is how to streamline our efforts in a way that we can also rely on each other's expertise for the production of this or this other weapon system, and what is more useful that we deliver to Ukraine, and what is more useful for us to keep in light of future crises that can arise. We've seen, for example, Russian interference in Africa through the Wagner Group, or the successor of the Wagner Group. We would be naive in thinking that this is going to be a stable continent. So we've seen already with many coups d'état that have been happening. So Italy will have to make this calculation as well, how its interests are best served in the context of European defense, in the context of developing also the European pillar of NATO, serving crises that may not mobilize every country in the same way.
Thank you very much. Very complete answer.
Giovanna,
Let me turn it back to June and the other panelists for other questions. Thank you.
June, Giovanna, I'm sorry. I have a question regarding relations with China. If you could focus on Italy's relations with China, apparently they are worsening to some extent, given the fact that apparently just last week, it was decided that Italy would not renew its arrangement with China regarding the Belt and Road Initiative, which it's been, I guess, going on for 2 or 3 years now. But I gather it's been rather disappointing for Italy. They had expected an increase in, trade between the two countries, and perhaps some technological exchanges, and apparently those have not materialized. So if you could comment on that.
Thank you so much, Tyler, for this very timely question. It's an excellent point that you make, and actually ties up with what I was talking about when I was mentioning the populist coalition government of the League and Five Star. They had been the ones that initiated the memorandum of understanding with China. So this memorandum of understanding was happened under a lot of backlash under populist nationalist coalition government, and had a lot of backlash from Washington and from other European countries, because Italy was the only G7 country signing up to the memorandum of understanding on the Belt and Road Initiative of China. This memorandum of understanding per se in the content was not particularly rich. There was some sort of establishing ground, and was watered down as well. Was some sort of way to establish ground rules for mutual engagement on certain issues. And at that time, it was actually Italy was trying to open up to China because, as I was mentioning earlier, the economic crisis has been dire. the consequences. I think one of our listeners has mentioned the birth rate, for example, declining, the effect of climate change, the fact that the brain drain, many small and medium enterprises, they were left with no, in America you have big corporations. In Italy, it's more smaller medium enterprises. They were left with not so much credit, and probably they turned to China in the hope not to fail. And the way China interacted with them was to give them capitals, but also kind of taking their know-how to be, able to produce the same things back in China. And this transformation regarding the relationship with China was also initiated actually starting from COVID, but more sharply with the war in Ukraine. With COVID, we've seen, obviously, Chinese unproductive and uncooperative behavior in trying to trace back the origin of the pandemic, shutting down the international community, and a very aggressive, I want to say, disinformation campaign in Italy, in which Chinese selling of masks and medical equipment were portrayed in many media as a gift from China. Instead, this was a purchase. So you see that Italy was already just about it, and also Italy realized how much it was the world and Europe was dependent on China. So that helped bringing an awareness on the threat coming from Chinese economic foot in Italy. And one of the measures that the government, actually by the initiative of the League, the nationalists, was to adopt this so-called golden power rule, basically allowing the government to veto any private contract that would concern national security sectors. So the League was introduced that a little bit, but Draghi's government implemented it, and Meloni's government as well. And I believe regarding the renouncing to the Memorandum of Understanding on Belt and Road, it's disappointing for China, because China really hoped that politically having Italy was going to be particularly effective. But in the facts, there had been no particular document, was quite empty in the first place. And also there had been no particular implementation on that, no sincere advantages. And since there were none, Italy was paying more for the political cost of being part of that than to renounce it. So you can see that in a way, it was more already de facto weakened in these particular terms. And given Chinese posture on the war in Ukraine, that was disappointing as well.
Thank you. Naomi, you're muted.
It helps to unmute myself, or maybe you'll find that it doesn't. Okay. Giovanna, thank you, number one. Two, winter is here. With the change in resources for natural gas, does Italy feel secure that it has the resources to get through the winter and beyond? Where does most of your natural gas come from? Is it the Mediterranean? And how stable is both that and the broader natural resource availability?
Thank you, Naomi, for your question. I want to say that the quest for new energy is always on. Italy has implemented a so-called a new plan that is called Piano Mattei. Mattei was the name of the founder of the Italian national energy company, ENI. And this new plan is mostly directed towards Algeria, Libya, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, In the meantime, the European import of liquefied natural gas from the United States has increased, while we're also trying to invest in renewables. And I want to stress that because it's a little bit of a different approach that the United States, probably one of the cultural difference on energy on the two sides of the pond. In Europe, given the effects of COVID, given the effect of climate change, we are trying to implement a vision of energy sobriety, meaning we try to use less energy in the first place. And how? In order to actually improve the resilience of our buildings, trying to increment our technologies that isolate better. So we have to use less AC and less heating in the first place. We're trying to the electrification of new routes, for example, new train routes instead of airplane, to facilitate and increase the transportation by train or by public transportation. So improving the energy efficiency of buildings and invest obviously in renewables. There has been a significant subsidies from the European Union as well to work on this. It's a long, you're right in pointing out how uncertain everything is, because Italy is a seismic zone. It's very exposed to natural disasters. So nothing is set in stone. But even if we had new gas routes, new LNG, new oil routes, this does not solve the geological issues that Italy has that are probably only be solved with collective global action on climate that can also, help reducing the consumption of energy and therefore the emissions. This government doesn't seem particularly active on this on climate, for example, but is more concerned in new routes. Obviously, it's the trade-off that you have to make between short-term, that you need to go through the winter, as you rightfully say, but long-term investment. But knowing that long-term investment, if you don't do it today, tomorrow is already too late.
Giovanna, I didn't hear you mention solar, and you have very long coastlines. Is solar?
Yes, solar is, sorry, I forgot to mention, indeed, renewables.
Yeah, is that an option that people are focused on?
Yes, indeed.
Okay.
There has been great incentives to put solar panels on your, if you're an owner of your own home, you can install solar panels, and you have energy credits even if you do that. So that, especially in south of Italy where it's very sunny, often that has been the option for many. Then there is still the importance of how do you get to work, how to use energy for that, and electric cars are not yet as widespread as they.
What about the wind farms off the coast?
That too.
People aren't objecting and saying that they ruin our vision of the Italian. We
had some in the Apulia region because it's very windy region on the Adriatic coast. They were there. They've been there for a long time.
Okay.
Don't really know the energy like in the Mediterranean, how impactful they may be, and how efficient they can be especially in the Med. But I'm sure that given that Italy is so energy thirsty, it would be it's an hypothesis that has been very much considered.
Talk a little bit about
questions.
Go ahead, Don.
Thank you. The following question I have, Giovanna, is dealing with decision-making in Italy. And I'm a civil engineer, and I've had two experiences, one having to do with the Leaning Tower in Pisa, where it took 20 years for the government to eventually come to the decision to do some work on the tower prior to it falling over. And the other one was back in the early 1960s, my professor, when I was doing a PhD then, Peter Rowe, was invited to be part of the Venice protection system, trying to look at stopping flooding in the center of the city and the problems dealing then. And so 60 years later, I'm always surprised when I see that the plaza in the church area still is getting flooded. So I have 60 years of experience in a way, watching brief with one, and 20 years before the decision was made to protect the Leaning Tower. And I just wonder, is that endemic to other questions within Italy? Does it take a long time to come to some decisions, even on foreign policy, for example?
Thank you, Don. It's $1 million question. One of the structural issues that Italy has is a very elaborated, intricate bureaucracy that slows down decision-making, the centralization of the decision-making doesn't always help. And it depends on a lot of factors, including budgets and funds. I come from the south of Italy, near Naples, and for example, Pompeii site that you obviously know has been neglected for several years. Investment in culture and preservation of the national patrimony have been slow. And has always been deprioritized compared to others, namely in energy or infrastructure, or even just basically huge public debt that Italy has. That has been slowing down lots of projects and initiatives that need to be obviously undertaken. Another aspect that I would add to the integrated bureaucracy is the volatility of the political system. You have coalition governments. You don't have, like, from the election, there is not one party. It's very rare that one party comes as the winner, complete winner of the majority of the seats. So that basically leads to the creation of coalitions that always they have hard time on topics, and sometimes this they can agree on very little. And the funds that were allocated to culture prior to the European Union and prior to significant projects that can also imply a requalification of the territory were very small, very restricted. So definitely political instability doesn't help. Because the government changes also relatively soon. So you don't have like big action or big infrastructure get launched that can actually get accomplished in the span of legislative term. Bureaucracy, but also the fact that the justice system is very slow. The fact that this is slow it's one of the biggest impediments from foreign direct investment, and everything that can be related also to delicate issues such as the Leaning Tower or any infrastructure work, because that actually create some resistance from people that want to get in the business, but they know that if anything goes wrong, they may need years until their controversies are dealt with, and this is very discouraging.
Thank you for that.
June, I wondered if you wanted to highlight any questions from the audience.
Yes, I think we're talking, I guess, about sort of the internal domestic issues that are going on in Italy. Then I think the question is, how does that influence what they're able to do in foreign policy? And are you seeing that there is an effort where, I mean, this is a country that is carrying a lot of debt, where its expenses are exceeding what it is bringing in. And so I think the long-term prospect of that without major change is rather bleak. So, and you know, as you were talking, it's limiting, I think, what in fact the priorities that the country has and how they're able to deal with it.
I think you're right in pointing this out because we have a far-right party and leader in charge. So you can imagine that the base on which she was elected was, you know, anti-immigration, economic crisis, and nationalistic power stances. What you got is someone that, yes, is focused on these issues, but also is following on the transatlantic space, not really a very nationalist or sovereignist agenda, but it's kind of falling into the ranks of Euro-Atlantic posture. This, I think, may create a fracture. I don't think we are there yet, but increased fracture between what she has been elected on and the reality of things and what she's doing. There is indeed a strong resentment towards the European Union because of immigration and the fact that Italy pushes for the modification of the amendment of the Dublin III regulation that basically force Italy to be the country, since it's the country where these refugees or migrants end, to process their asylum requests. So this takes a long time, and this results in people staying on the national territory for a longer time. So Italy wants this to be modified, but having strong opposition, especially from the same far-right people in the European Union. They don't want a redistribution of migrants, a redistribution of refugees. So you can see that, you know, Giorgia Meloni is trying to walk a very fine line, a very thin line between what's feasible and what's not feasible. And probably, I believe that her electorate may have wanted a stronger stance, more aggressive stance against the European Union. So I have to say that the far right and the right bloc is quite united, tends to be more united than the left one. So they're more able to navigate through this more pragmatically. But I believe that the Italian public opinion will definitely, if we're talking about the impact on foreign policy, Italian public opinion may lean towards less help for Ukraine as well, some sort of compromise with Russia, tougher stance with the European Union on migration, and especially on budget and fiscal flexibility to allow domestic investments that are so needed to boost the Italian economy, given the impact of COVID as well.
Thank you. Let's see.
Giovanna, I've got a question, if you would. You mentioned earlier, obviously, that Italy, along with other Western European countries, has a low birth rate problem. And I guess Italy's is particularly severe. I saw a figure the other day that indicated that at the present rate, by 2050, the birth rate in Italy will actually fall by something like 2/3. So what I'm asking is does the Brothers of Italy party have a philosophy or an approach to countering the rapidly declining birth rate? I mean, we know they're kind of anti-immigration, so that's one factor that obviously is going to influence the population over in the future. So what would your thoughts on that be?
Thank you for mentioning that. This was actually one of the points that Giorgia Meloni and her campaigned on basically politics in support of families. That also imply some economic benefits for big families and for also daycare for these families. The question is that this is, at least in my view, this is not a solution. This can help a little bit, but what the main problem is that people are, especially young people, or even my generation, that have probably graduated during the peak of economic crisis, of 2008 economic crisis. They struggle to find a long-term job. They always find like very short-term contracts with very little guarantees. And so they are less and less prone to have children because they feel that their economic status is not secure. So I believe that intervening on the job side and more protection and more opportunities for people, for young people, would be probably a better way to boost a birth rate, because it's definitely a matter of job security rather than 1,000 euros one-time bonus if you have a second kid.
And out-migration is also a problem, isn't it? Where you're.
I mean, migration, if you allow me, like it would be.
Right.
Sorry, yes,
Right.
yes. Brain drain, migration of educated people is definitely, Italy cannot keep its people. Unfortunately, I'm one of them. I no longer in Italy, but like that shows you that even though I benefited from Italian education, it was great. I had my PhD paid by the university, the Italian government. I lived until like I was 24 in Italy, and benefited from public hospital, public system, even having a return of investment for me and people like me that are abroad and they are not invested in the economy of their own country. And in that way, that new migration can help with the birth rates, but the discussion that what worries me is that this government is very much focused on the Italianness rather than Italians as more broadly citizens, and so less prone to welcome immigrants because of the fear of cultural clashes. And this does not facilitate integration. This creates more and more social fractures that it's tough to mend. Later in the life of a kid that is born in Italy is not considered Italian until he or she turns 18.
Giovanna, a quick question. Historically, the south of Italy obviously has economically trailed the north for, reasons we're quite familiar with. And my sense is the government has long had a policy to try to equivalate, if that's not the right word, but anyway, to bring into balance the south and the north economically. Do you think it has succeeded partially or not very well or better than we might have expected to make the two parts of Italy more economically stable or equivalent in terms of per capita income and so forth?
To be fair, I don't think that's the case. You still have like mostly in the north, like the industrial base is very much in the north of Italy. Now with the digital economy, something is shifting as well to the south. People are also moving back. But the main, I want to say, to my knowledge, the main train of migration is south towards the north. And this also leads to an impoverishment, of intellectual impoverishment of the south of Italy. There's a lot of, if you go to Milan, you will see probably 7 out of 10 people are from Naples. So you see that how people have migrated to other regions and seek for different economic opportunities, and it's sad, but that's the reality of things. And that it's no secret that every government that comes to power always has some sort of relaunch plan for the south of Italy to boost its economy and its connectivity.
So June, I don't know if we have any additional questions from the online folks. If not, maybe we've got our last question.
I think we have more or less covered the questions
Okay.
that have been coming in.
Good.
I think this was a fascinating presentation, but and you may want to say more, but I was, spellbound by all the things that you said. My head is still spinning on the politics, but I think we have a much better understanding of, Italy, what's happening internally, as well as the challenges that it's facing in trying to balance sort of its Western leanings with also Russia and China.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you, Giovanna. You've really brought kind of a perspective from both sides of the Atlantic. You've had a fascinating background of going back and forth a bit. Thank you for all the nuance you've given us about these important questions. And thank you for spending this time with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Giovanna,
Thank you.
Italy is amazingly confident at balancing and dancing to whatever the music playing, the issues are. I've been fascinated ever since being a poli-sci major in college. All the governments and the country goes on. So congratulations to you and all of your fellow Italians. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you. It was a
you.
pleasure being with you and
Yeah,
discussing
thank
these
you.
issues with you. Have a
Okay.
great day.
Thank you.
So
I know.
as we close out the year, I want to wish everyone a happy 2024. Can we believe we're almost there? And as we all hope for peace, and I guess it's an enduring hope. Hopefully we will do better this next year. Our spring program will kick off on Monday, February 12th, with Evelyn Farkas speaking on Ukraine. She has a vast experience in national security and foreign affairs and is currently the executive director of the McCain Institute at Arizona State University. Before that, she was President Obama's Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, Eurasia, and many other things has she done. So we look forward to seeing you again in a couple of months. In the meantime, season's greeting, be safe and healthy, and we look forward to seeing you. And thank you again, Giovanna.